From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The voters, at long last, get their say in the presidential primaries with the Iowa caucuses a week away. Kyle Peterson will tell you what he's seen on the ground in the Hawkeye state and why Donald Trump is suddenly preoccupied with Nikki Haley. Plus, President Biden uses a blistering speech to lay out his main campaign theme, that Donald Trump is an unprecedented threat to democracy and cannot get a second term. Is this the path to a second term for Joe Biden? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, and I'm here with my colleagues Kim Strassel and Kyle Peterson, who we mentioned before. Let's start with a report from Kyle on what he saw in Iowa. And doing reporting, he spent a few days in the lovely Midwestern state, where, by the way, he also went to college at Iowa State in Ames, which is about a half hour north of Des Moines, the capital. Kyle, you followed Ron DeSantis around at some of his events. What did you see and hear? Because DeSantis really needs a good showing here in Iowa.
Yeah, I went to several DeSantis events and then also some Nikki Haley events. And these are generally held at a restaurant or a bar or a winery, and sometimes early in the morning, sometimes late at night, 8:30, 9 o'clock. And yet you get 100 or 150 people packed in there waiting to hear from the candidates. And it's kind of interesting. The contrast I've been thinking about is between Haley and DeSantis is the contrast between poetry and prose. So Haley will come in. She's a long stump speech. It's rhetorically effective. She knows how to deliver a self-deprecating joke, to do a dramatic pause. Often she takes no questions, but she has plenty of time for selfies with the fans and speaking with them one-on-one after her speech. People in the audience say that they see her as transformational, not polarizing. They think she can appeal to swing voters and Democrats. One of her big applause lines is when she says that there is a poll showing her beating Joe Biden by 17 points. And then she goes through and says that is a mandate that would get us offices, not only from the presidency, but all the way down through Congress and the states and the school boards. And the DeSantis events are sort of the inverse. He has a pretty short stump speech that he blazes through, and there are some lines in there that are obviously written to be soaring rhetoric about the founders and Gettysburg and Normandy, and he's delivering them at about 85 miles an hour without a whole lot of emotion. But then he takes questions from all comers to shout it out in the sports bar, and people there say, look at his record. I don't care about the rhetoric, but look at how he's handled those hurricanes. Often there's some kind of Florida connection. I escaped there during COVID, one woman told me, or I have a sister that just moved there, and the place just works. And so forget about what these candidates are saying and look at the guy's records. And so now it seems like there's a lot of enthusiasm on both sides. And to some point, it's an expectations game. I think Ron DeSantis, with a strong second showing here, could breathe some new life into his candidacy. Or you could have Nikki Haley coming out of Iowa as number 2 and getting some big momentum going into New Hampshire.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump supporters in our audience would say, yeah, well, fine, you're all handicapping second place here. Trump's going to run away with it. But Kim, there's a real question here about just how strongly Trump will perform. There's no question he's in the lead in Iowa. But once the voters actually show up, how big will his performance be? Will it be closer to 40 than 50? Will it be over 50? If it's over 50, that's a very strong performance. But if it's down to 40 and you get one of the other two breaking up and getting pretty close, then it becomes kind of interesting. And maybe the dominance that the polls have shown for Donald Trump don't mean as much when it actually comes down to voters saying, who do I want to be president for the next 4 years?
Yeah, I think Donald Trump has a couple of challenges here. I mean, as you note, I looked it up in the Real Clear Politics average. He's about 32 points ahead of everybody in Iowa right now. And the lowest number he has had in Iowa all along is 23 points. But one problem they have, as you note, is expectations, that if they come in lower, that could make them look vulnerable going into the next races. And notably, and this is interesting, his campaign is out there right now trying to lower those expectations, reminding reporters that no GOP candidate has won Iowa by more than 12 points since Bob Dole in 1988. And that therefore, if they did better than that, they're still doing better than anybody in history. But I think this gets to the other problem is complacency. And I know the Trump campaign is extremely worried about this right now. Donald Trump in a recent speech said, the biggest risk to us is we're winning by so much, darling, let's just stay home and watch television and not go to the caucuses. And I think add to that the Trump campaign, he's very good at the rallies. One thing that he struggled with in both of the past two campaigns is a ground game. There's a lot of talk right now in Iowa about his team and how much they're actually doing on that regard. Iowans have a history of breaking late. And sometimes that organization really matters, especially in a confusing and more complicated situation like a caucus. So we'll see if this is all, if he's been coasting, as it were, that could end up being a problem for him come caucus day.
There are listeners who have never attended a caucus as opposed to a primary. This isn't where you show up and cast a ballot and then go home. This is, you spend an evening. You go there and you sit. And it's organized into groups, the Trump folks over here and the different places where the caucuses meet, the DeSantis voters over there, there's the Haley voters, and so on. You got to spend some time there. So busy people who have to get up and take the kids to school in the morning and then get to work. And it's a cold night, not always the most pleasant way to spend an evening. So that matters. And on the point of organization, Kyle, you know that Haley has been endorsed by the Americans for Prosperity PAC, which is helping her organizing. They claim to have a lot of grassroots organizing on the ground. DeSantis has been organizing with Iowa in mind for months and spending a lot of money to do it. So they're putting a lot of money into that. I don't know how strong the AFP effort for Haley will be, but it does give her something that she can fall back on. And then you have the governor of Iowa, Kim Reynolds, who's endorsed DeSantis, and she has an organization she's putting at his disposal.
I agree with Kim. How much organization Donald Trump has going in Iowa, I think, is an open question. But I think you're right that DeSantis is probably the leader in the field in this regard. He has spent a lot of time in Iowa. He's been to all 99 counties, done the full Grassley, as it is referred to, of course, referring to the senator from Iowa, Chuck Grassley, who has made a habit of doing that. And Haley, I think the endorsement by the Koch network and Americans for Prosperity has helped her with door knocking and so forth. I don't know how much of a distinction that is of what happens on caucus night, because often there are people at the caucuses who speak on behalf of each of those candidates. And so the quality of the local precinct captains and so forth can matter as well, because if you have swing voters, people who have seen some of these candidates in the caucus room but have not made up their mind yet, then that is your campaign's last shot to bring those people over to your corner. And if you have a great speech from a DeSantis person in the caucus room and then kind of a so-so one from a Nikki Haley person, that could make a difference to a handful of voters. And one last thought here while we're talking about that and the idea of Trump underperformance, I think that is an interesting thing to keep an eye on. And the forecast, at least a week out for Monday caucus day, is high of 2 degrees and a low on Monday night of -8. So, Paul, just as you are saying, if there are people who are fans of one of the candidates, but not necessarily deeply politically committed, those are the kind of people you can imagine saying, I don't know, it's pretty warm here on my couch, and I will just watch how things play out.
As we used to say in Green Bay, put on your long johns before you go out. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk more about Iowa and then Joe Biden's big theme when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on Potomac Watch, our Wall Street Journal opinion podcast. And we're talking about the Iowa caucuses a week away. And one of the things that's happened here in the last week, Kim, that you've tracked, is Donald Trump has turned his attention focus to Nikki Haley. He's been attacking Ron DeSantis throughout, but suddenly he's aiming at Nikki Haley. Let's listen to Donald Trump talk about the former South Carolina governor.
She opposed my border wall, Nikki. She condemned my strong borders policy, and in 2016, she stabbed the Republican Party in the back by siding with Barack Hussein Obama against a thing called the Trump travel ban. We didn't want to have people from countries that hate us coming into our country. We don't want our shopping centers blown up, if it's okay with you. We don't want our people killed and decimated and bombed and shot and everything else. So, and it passed. It went through the Supreme Court. It just passed.
Kim, of course, the Supreme Court doesn't pass anything. It heard the case there. A Democrat sued to stop the travel ban. It was stopped by lower court judges, but the Supreme Court on a 5-4 vote overruled them and says that it was in fact legal. Nikki Haley hasn't, I don't remember the facts about what she said about the travel ban at the time. She was a part of the administration. So I don't know how much she really opposed what Trump was doing. What do you make of that? And why is Trump suddenly attacking her?
Yeah, both of those instances are overrated by the way Trump describes them. What she actually said when it came to the border wall was that she didn't think a border wall alone was enough to protect the border. That's very different than opposing a border wall. She would say that she was okay with a border wall as a piece of border security. Also, when it came to that question of the travel ban, don't forget that Trump had various iterations of that travel ban before the one that actually ended up in front of the Supreme Court.
He modified it significantly.
Correct. She disagreed with one of the earlier ones, which many of his own advisors actually said was problematic because it was more based on a religious test than it was the circumstances surrounding the countries that were on the list. They changed that, and the one that went in front of the Supreme Court was very different, and I believe Haley has said one that she was fine with in the end. So it's a little bit overrated. All of the candidates are struggling a bit to find areas of policy to pick each other out on because in reality, there is a huge amount of difference on some of these issues, especially some of the domestic ones. Look, in overall, Trump's attitude toward Haley and the way he's attacking her is to say that she's in the pocket of establishment donors, comparing all of his opponents to Jeb Bush and Paul Ryan, the battle days. They'll sell you out just like she sold me out. He keeps harping on about the fact that she'd initially said she wouldn't run against him, and now here she is running against him. He's scared of her in New Hampshire, and he has a reason to be. She's really been moving up in the polls. That's a state he's not doing as well as. You have to imagine a scenario in which he comes out of Iowa, as we've suggested, much weaker than he might have expected to, with less of a win. And then she's there and she's really attracting a lot of independents there. So she's become a target of both DeSantis and Trump as the person to go after and take down, almost entirely as a function of the fact that since about mid-December or early December, she's been on a rise, both in terms of the donor support she's been getting, but her standing in the polls.
Kyle, what did you see when you were watching television on the airwaves? How are the candidates making their case there as opposed to events?
What I heard from a lot of voters was that all the ads are negative. And I thought that was actually pretty interesting because from the national standpoint, if you're watching this from afar and reading the news stories, the dispatches that reporters are filing, that tends to be what is focused on because that's the news. So, if there's an event somewhere and DeSantis unveils one new jab at one of these guys, Trump or Haley, that is what leads the story as DeSantis goes after Haley or Trump on X or Y. And I was surprised at the number of voters who were not interested in that and specifically brought up the negativity of the ads that they've been seeing. There was at least one candidate who also made reference to that. Caucus day is almost here, which means the TV ads with the text messages will soon stop going to all of you guys, which got a laugh and some applause in the audience. But it seemed from regular voters that they were more interested in hearing about policies and what these individual candidates' rhetoric was and how they intended to move the country forward, and in some cases bring the country back together. And specifically at the Haley events, people talked about that a lot. And so I get a sense that the ads are negative and that many Iowans are just over them.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how Haley holds up under the pressure, the dual pressure and criticism of DeSantis and Trump, because DeSantis, in particular, the stakes are enormous in Iowa. He's put so much attention there. He is not, as Kim noted, as strong in New Hampshire as Haley. So if he doesn't do as well as he hopes in Iowa, that means he will really face a tough decision about whether to drop out. And Haley has to hope that she can finish second in Iowa, or at least a close third, if that's where she finishes, to DeSantis. That will at least give her some momentum going into New Hampshire, and then we can see what she can do there. This week, Kyle, I guess there's going to be a couple of town hall events, and then there'll be a Haley DeSantis debate. Of course, Trump isn't participating in any debates with the fellow Republicans. So that'll be telling as well. We'll get some carry in the state.